Hello, welcome, or welcome back. It's good to see you again. Please take a seat. We're about to begin. Disclaimer. Caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings, stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. What is a fairy tale? Before we begin tonight's story, a quick word about fairy tales. Fairy tales are some of the oldest stories ever told. Long before they were written in books, they were passed down through generations by word of mouth, told around fires, in homes, and in village squares. With every telling, the stories changed slightly, evolving into the versions we recognize today. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they often include magic, curses, strange creatures, enchanted objects, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the Brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences often think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. These stories were warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the dangers and hardships of the world in which they were first told. In this series, we explore those earlier versions, the darker origins behind the stories many of us grew up with. Tonight's story is one of the most famous of them all. Series 1, Episode 6, Rapunzel, The Secret Hidden in the Tower. Most people know the story of Rapunzel. A beautiful young girl is locked in a tall tower by a wicked witch. With no door and no staircase, the only way to reach the tower is by climbing her long, golden hair. Eventually, a prince discovers the tower and secretly visits Rapunzel. But in the version most people know today, the story remains fairly simple. The prince rescues Rapunzel, and the two escape together. The end. But the original Grimm version tells a slightly different story, one that reveals something the witch eventually discovers. How Rapunzel was taken. In the Grimm version, Rapunzel's story begins before she is even born. Her mother becomes obsessed with a plant growing in a neighboring garden. This garden belongs to a powerful sorceress. The plant is called Rapunzel, a type of leafy vegetable similar to rampion. When Rapunzel's father is caught stealing the plant, the sorceress demands payment. The couple must give her their child once it is born. And so Rapunzel is taken. The tower. As Rapunzel grows older, the sorceress locks her inside a tall tower deep in the forest. There is no door, no staircase, only a small window high above the ground. When the sorceress wishes to enter the tower, she calls out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel lowers her long golden braid, and the sorceress climbs up. One day, a prince hears Rapunzel singing from the tower and discovers the secret. Soon he begins visiting her in secret. But their meetings do not remain secret forever. The discovery. In the original Grimm version, Rapunzel eventually reveals the truth herself. One day she innocently says to the sorceress, "Why is it that my dress is becoming so tight?" With that simple sentence, the witch realizes the truth. Rapunzel has become pregnant. Furious, the sorceress cuts off Rapunzel's hair and abandons her in the wilderness. The prince's fate. When the prince returns to the tower, he calls out as usual. But instead of Rapunzel, the sorceress lowers the long braid. When the prince climbs into the tower, the witch confronts him. In despair, the prince leaps from the tower. He survives the fall, but lands among thorns that blind him. For years he wanders the wilderness, until one day he hears a familiar voice. Rapunzel. Her tears fall onto his eyes and restore his sight. And the two are finally reunited. Why stories like this changed. In early fairy tales, stories often reflected real social fears. Pregnancy outside of marriage, isolation, and punishment were themes that appeared frequently. Over time, many of these details were softened or removed as fairy tales became stories told primarily to children. But the original versions often contained lessons meant for older audiences. Today, Rapunzel is remembered as a magical story about a girl with impossibly long hair trapped in a tower. But the original version reveals a much more complicated tale, one that included secrets, exile, and years of suffering. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Please stay with us as we give you another story from the dark origins of fairy tales, The Maiden Without Hands. While Rapunzel tells of a young woman imprisoned in a tower, other fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm tell of even harsher trials faced by those who wished to protect their freedom. One of the most haunting of these stories is called The Maiden Without Hands. In this tale, a poor miller one day meets a mysterious stranger in the forest. The stranger promises the miller great wealth in exchange for whatever stands behind his house. Believing the stranger is speaking of his apple tree, the miller agrees. But when he returns home, he realizes with horror that the stranger was no ordinary traveler. It was the devil himself, and what stood behind the miller's house was his own daughter. The girl is pure and devout, and the devil cannot claim her as long as she remains untouched by sin. Furious, the devil commands the miller to remove her hands so she cannot defend herself. Terrified and desperate, the miller obeys. Rather than live under the devil's claim, the young woman leaves home and wanders the world alone, her hands gone and her future uncertain. After a long journey, she finds refuge in a royal garden, where the king discovers her kindness and courage. Despite her condition, he marries her. But the devil is not finished with her. Through trickery and false messages, he causes the king to believe his wife and newborn child have vanished. The young queen once again leaves the kingdom and wanders the wilderness, raising her child in hiding. Years later, the king finally discovers the truth and searches for his lost family. When they are reunited, the queen's hands are miraculously restored. Stories like The Maiden Without Hands remind us that many fairy tales were not merely stories of magic, but tales of endurance, stories of people who survived terrible trials before finding peace. Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this tale. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know more about? Please leave us a comment. Help us reach 50 subs by subscribing and turning on the notifications, and never miss another episode again. If you'd like to help us with YouTube analytics, press the like button. Be sure to return next week when the Ember and Ink Studios presents Series 1, Episode 7, Rumpelstiltskin, The Price of a Child.